Somewhere in the Sonoran Desert, beneath a thin layer of asphalt and New Mexico caliche, there are millions of video game cartridges. They were buried quietly in the middle of the night in September of 1983, crushed by steamrollers, covered in concrete, and hidden from the world like evidence of a crime. In a way, that is exactly what they were. This is the story of how a company that did not exist in 1971 became the fastest-growing corporation in American business history by 1982, and how, by the end of 1983, it had lost $536 million, triggered the near-total collapse of an entire industry, and driven itself so far into the ground that it literally buried its own legacy in the dirt. The name on those cartridges was Atari. At its peak, that name meant something extraordinary. It meant the future, delivered to your living room. It meant that a generation of American children had experienced something no generation before them ever had: a machine that turned your television into a portal to another world. By 1982, Atari was generating $2 billion in annual revenue. It employed more than 10,000 people. Its parent company, Warner Communications, watched Atari account for more than half of its total corporate profits. Wall Street analysts competed to see who could issue the most bullish forecast. Nobody, not the investors, not the executives, not the journalists covering the technology industry, believed it could end. That is always how these stories begin. Then came the silence. To understand what Atari lost, you have to understand what Atari built, and how improbable it was that they built it at all. It started in 1972 in a rented space in Santa Clara, California, with a pinball machine for collateral and a borrowed $1,200. Nolan Bushnell was 30 years old. He had an engineer's mind and a carnival barker's instinct for what people wanted before they knew they wanted it. His co-founder, Ted Dabney, shared the technical discipline. Together they created Pong, a video arcade game so simple that its entire instruction manual read, "Avoid missing ball for high score." It became a phenomenon. Bars had fistfights over who got to play next. The prototype unit at Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale stopped working within days of installation, not because it was broken, but because it was so full of quarters the coin mechanism jammed. From that beginning, Bushnell built something that had never existed before, a consumer electronics company defined entirely by play. Atari's offices were famously loose, famously creative, sometimes famously chaotic. Engineers kept beer in the lab. Decisions were made fast, often on instinct. There was a culture of velocity, of getting the product out, watching what happened, adjusting, and moving again. For a time, that culture was the company's greatest competitive advantage. When Atari released the video computer system, later known as the Atari 2600, in 1977, it changed the structure of American entertainment permanently. For the first time, you could buy a single machine and then buy games separately, each one a new experience, each one another sale. The cartridge-based home console was not just a product. It was an ecosystem. By 1980, the 2600 was in millions of American homes. Christmas morning 1980, an estimated 4 million Atari units were unwrapped. The company that had borrowed $1,200 to get started had become, in the words of one business journalist at the time, the fastest-growing company in the history of the United States. Warner Communications had acquired Atari in 1976 for $28 million. By 1982, analysts were valuing the division at well over $2 billion. The people who made that acquisition looked like geniuses. The people running Atari looked invincible. They were not. Every catastrophic failure contains a moment, or a cluster of moments, where a decision that seemed reasonable at the time set an irreversible course. For Atari, that moment arrived in 1982, and it wore the face of the most anticipated video game license in history. Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial opened in June of 1982 and became, within weeks, the highest-grossing film ever made at that point. Every studio, every toy company, every retailer in America wanted a piece of it. Atari's management, watching the cultural phenomenon unfold, made what appeared to be a straightforward business decision: acquire the video game rights and release a tie-in game in time for Christmas 1982. The licensing fee was enormous, reportedly between $20 and $25 million, but Atari's leadership believed the logic was ironclad. The film had already sold hundreds of millions of dollars in tickets. A game with E.T.'s name on it would sell itself. All they needed was a product on the shelf. There was a problem. The licensing deal was not finalized until late July. Christmas retail deadlines required finished cartridges in warehouses by the end of September. That left a single Atari programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw, exactly 5.5 weeks to design, build, and complete a game from scratch. To be clear, a typical Atari game development cycle at the time took 6 to 9 months. Warshaw was being asked to do it in 36 days. In the internal meetings where this timeline was discussed, concerns were raised. They were noted. They were overruled. The commercial argument was overwhelming. At least, it seemed overwhelming from inside a company that had spent years watching its products sell no matter what. Atari's entire recent history suggested that the brand and the license would carry the product regardless of its quality. The market had been forgiving. Consumers were hungry. The machine was already in millions of homes. What could go wrong? This is the trap that success builds around itself. Atari's leadership was not reckless. They were applying the lessons their own success had taught them, that speed mattered more than polish, that the appetite for new cartridges was essentially limitless, that the Atari name was a guarantee of desire, if not of quality. The data they had supported the decision. The culture they had built rewarded the decision. And every incentive in the building pushed in one direction. They ordered 4 million cartridges. The E.T. game shipped in December of 1982. Reviewers were confused by it. Players were frustrated. The game had a central mechanic, a pit that the character fell into repeatedly, that felt less like a challenge and more like a malfunction. Children who had saved up or asked their parents for what they expected to be the Christmas gift of the decade tore off the wrapping, loaded the cartridge, and felt something new in the history of video gaming: profound disappointment. Returns flooded back to retailers. Atari had pressed 4 million cartridges for a market that, it turned out, wanted somewhere closer to 1 million. But E.T. was not the only problem. It was the most visible symptom of a disease that had been spreading through the entire industry for 2 years. Because Atari had proven that home video games could make enormous money, everyone wanted in. Atari had itself licensed games from dozens of third-party developers without meaningful quality control, a policy born of the same confidence that had greenlighted E.T., but other companies had gone further. Activision, founded in 1979 by defecting Atari programmers, had demonstrated that third-party cartridge publishing was viable. In their wake came dozens of imitators, companies producing hastily constructed games with no design discipline, flooding the market with product that ranged from mediocre to actively broken. By the end of 1982, an Atari owner browsing a toy store shelf faced hundreds of cartridge titles. The majority were not worth buying, but there was no reliable way to know which ones were worthwhile before you spent $30. Consumer trust, the invisible infrastructure on which the entire ecosystem rested, began to corrode. In January of 1983, Atari announced that its fourth-quarter earnings for 1982 would fall dramatically short of Wall Street's expectations. The announcement wiped out 35% of Warner Communications' stock value in a single day. It was one of the largest single-day losses in the history of the New York Stock Exchange to that point. Internally, the company scrambled. Externally, the press began to circle. The layoffs came quickly. Atari cut around 1/3 of its workforce, thousands of employees, in the spring and summer of 1983. Senior executives departed. The Atari 2600 was aggressively discounted in an attempt to sustain hardware sales, which further compressed margins. The company began work on next-generation products, the Atari 5200, the 1200 XL home computer, but the development cycles were fractured by internal reorganization and the loss of key engineering talent. Products shipped with known defects. Deadlines slipped. The culture of velocity that had once been an asset had become something else. A culture of reaction, always behind, always firefighting. Meanwhile, the broader industry contracted with stunning speed. The North American video game market, which had generated approximately $3 billion in revenue in 1982, would generate less than $100 million by 1985. That is not a slowdown. That is a collapse of approximately 97%. Retailers who had devoted entire aisles to video games began filling that space with other merchandise. The word Atari shifted in the public vocabulary, quietly, then unmistakably, from a synonym for excitement to a cautionary noun. There had been moments where the trajectory might have bent. A serious quality control framework imposed on third-party developers in 1981 might have slowed the market's saturation. A decision not to greenlight ET on an impossible timeline or to ship a smaller, more realistic quantity might have preserved the consumer trust that was Atari's most valuable and most fragile asset. A leadership structure less insulated from honest internal dissent might have heard the warnings that, by multiple accounts, were present in the building. Each of these interventions was available. None of them happened. By the summer of 1983, the story had become undeniable. Warner Communications, which had purchased Atari 7 years earlier as a dual acquisition, was now carrying it as a wound. The division had gone from generating more than half of Warner's total profits to consuming them. The $536 million loss figure that would define Atari's collapse was not an accounting abstraction. It represented real decisions by real people, engineers who had poured their careers into products that were now being discounted to $1, retailers who had staked floor space on a category that was evaporating, consumers who had invested emotionally and financially in a platform that its own creators were abandoning in real time. In September of 1983, a fleet of trucks arrived at a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Workers unloaded an estimated 10 to 14 truckloads of Atari inventory, cartridges, hardware units, packaging, and deposited them in a municipal dump. A steamroller passed over the pile. Concrete was poured on top. The city of Alamogordo placed a layer of fresh asphalt over the site, and within days, the physical evidence of the world's largest video game company's overproduction was gone from sight. The story circulated as rumor for decades. It was so strange, so perfectly symbolic, that many people assumed it was an urban legend. In 2014, a documentary crew excavated the site. The cartridges were there, hundreds of thousands of them, compressed and discolored but legible. ET cartridges among them, yes, but also Centipede, Missile Command, Pac-Man. The full catalog of Atari's golden era buried. Warner sold Atari's consumer division in 1984 to Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore, for a sum that various sources place at between $25 and $50 million. 7 years after acquiring it for $28 million, Warner was essentially breaking even on the transaction while having absorbed hundreds of millions in operating losses. The employees who remained, by that point, a fraction of the peak workforce, faced the particular disorientation of watching the company they had helped build change hands in a transaction that valued it as a distressed asset. The journalists who had once written profiles of Atari as the emblem of American entrepreneurial ingenuity now filed retrospectives. The word they reached for most often was hubris. It was not wrong, but it was not quite right either. Hubris is too simple an explanation for what happened to Atari and too comfortable. It lets everyone off the hook with a story about arrogance and excess. The deeper lesson is more precise and more disturbing because it applies not to unusual companies but to ordinary ones. Atari did not fail because its leaders were stupid or corrupt. It failed because its leaders were captured, completely and almost invisibly, by the model that had made them successful. The cartridge ecosystem had generated such extraordinary returns for so long that the company's entire decision-making infrastructure was calibrated to serve and protect it, even when the ecosystem itself was becoming the problem. Quality control meant slower development cycles, which meant fewer releases, which meant lower short-term revenue, and in a company running at the velocity Atari ran at, short-term revenue was the only metric that felt real. This is the structural trap that Atari's story exposes, the way that genuine past success can colonize an organization's imagination so thoroughly that the people inside it become constitutionally unable to imagine the success ending. They are not in denial, exactly. They can recite the risks. They can acknowledge the concerns raised in meetings. But the lived experience of the company, the culture, the incentives, the career trajectories, the language people use to describe themselves, all of it encodes the assumption of continued success so deeply that acting against it feels like irrationality. The people who pressed 4 million ET cartridges were not gamblers. They were followers of a model that had never failed them. Every organization that has experienced sustained success is building that trap right now in its own way. The assumptions that feel like wisdom are often just the accumulated momentum of past outcomes. The voices that get heard in important meetings are the ones whose previous predictions aligned with what actually happened, which means the people who have been most right about a world that no longer exists. The question that Atari's collapse forces onto any leadership team is, what would it look like if we were wrong about the thing we are most certain of? Most organizations never ask it, not because they are arrogant, because they are busy. Today, the name Atari still exists. It has passed through multiple ownership structures over the decades, been licensed, revived, rebranded, and quietly reinvented so many times that it bears almost no organizational relationship to the company Nolan Bushnell, founded in that rented Santa Clara space in 1972. A company called Atari SA, based in France, has held the intellectual property and attempted periodic revivals. A retro console here, a branded hotel concept there, cryptocurrency experiments in the early 2020s. The reception has been, at best, nostalgic. The name still resonates with people who grew up in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which is precisely the tragedy of it. The brand's only real value is as a monument to something that is gone. The industry Atari created, by contrast, is enormous. Video games generate more annual revenue today than the global film and music industries combined. The home console ecosystem that the Atari 2600 pioneered, buy a machine, buy games separately, build a library, is the direct architectural ancestor of the PlayStation, the Xbox, and the Nintendo Switch. The language of interactive entertainment that Bushnell and his engineers developed in those loose, beer-in-the-lab offices in the 1970s is the language that 3 billion people on this planet now speak fluently. Atari built the room, it just didn't get to stay in it. Beneath the asphalt in Alamogordo, the cartridges are still there, a generation's worth of ambition and miscalculation compressed into silence. The desert doesn't explain what happened, but it remembers everything.